When I was 16, my friends and I saw the movie Arthur with Dudley Moore so many times that we basically had it memorized. In fact, when we went to the movies, and this would be towards the end of the summer, right before the semester started, we would sometimes repeat the dialogue out loud, which, as you can imagine, everybody else there to see the movie really appreciated, especially when we had been, breaking into our parents' liquor cabinets, shall we say. Anyway, the reason I've been thinking about Arthur, and one scene in particular, is because of a conversation that has been going on. The scene I'm talking about is at the beginning of the movie, and Arthur has picked up a woman who's clearly a prostitute, and he brings her to the Plaza Hotel for drinks. He runs into his aunt and uncle on their way to the table, and it's a little bit awkward. So he introduces his companion to his aunt and uncle as a princess from a very small country in the West Indies. He then goes on to describe the country. And the reason I've been thinking about that scene is because of crowd sizes. Now, any reasonable person, anybody with an ounce of maturity, anybody with any understanding of how politics work in this country knows that crowd size has absolutely nothing to do with what happens on election day. Right? Any reasonable, mature person. Which brings us to Donald. Now, as you probably are aware, for years now, Donald has been equating with his crowd sizes with his electoral power, with his worth, even as a human being.
Here's a picture of the crowd. Now, the audience was the biggest ever.
That speech was a home run. It was the biggest standing ovation since Peyton Manning had won the Super Bowl, and they said it was equal. One thing this shows is how far over they go here. Look how far this is. This goes.
And denigrating anybody who doesn't have or doesn't seem to draw large crowds, even if it's in the middle of a global pandemic. Like, we know that was one of his biggest criticisms against President Biden before he started attacking President Biden for being 3 years older than he was President Biden's apparent inability to draw a crowd. Well, things have changed, haven't they? We now see in the 3 weeks since Vice President Harris has taken over the top of the Democratic ticket that this whole election has been turned on its head. And in terms of rally crowd sizes, energy levels of enthusiasm, it's been a 180-degree turn. And Donald isn't exactly handling it well. At his press conference, so-called press conference last week, he actually claimed, contrary to all available evidence, including the evidence we can see with our own eyes, that his crowd sizes continue to be the biggest ever in history, and that on January 6th, in fact, he drew as many, if not more people than Martin Luther King did for his I Have a Dream speech.
The biggest crowd I've ever spoken, I've spoken to the biggest crowds. Nobody's spoken to crowds bigger than me. If you look at Martin Luther King, when he did his speech, his great speech, and you look at ours, same real estate, same everything, same number of people, if not, we had more.
Let's ignore for the minute just how insulting and disgraceful it is that he would compare Martin Luther King's just game-changing speech about race in America to Donald's inciting of an insurrection. The claim that his crowd was anywhere near the size of Martin Luther King Jr.'s is absurd. Most of what Donald claims is absurd. The reason Donald is continuing to perpetuate this ridiculously easy lie, fact-checkable lie, is because he's desperate. Not only can he fill seats anymore, and it's understandably why, he's really boring. He's saying the same thing over and over again. It's all about darkness and division and apocalypse and dystopia and how bad things are for him. He has no positive vision, and he's not offering anybody anything in terms of policy.
We intend to slash prices by half within 12 months, at a maximum 18 months. And if it doesn't work out, you'll say, oh, well, I voted for him.
He's only talking about how, how mean people are to him and how he's out to get anybody who doesn't support him, including very popular Republicans like Governor Brian Kemp in Georgia. The real problem, though, is that there's somebody who actually is drawing massive crowds.
In Glendale, reports of 15,000 people there, more than Barack Obama had in his 2008 campaign. But you have people talking about these things like their rock shows, like their Taylor Swift events.
And that's a black woman named Kamala Harris who is drawing crowds who are literally like rocking the rafters. Right? And she's beating him. She's beating him in his own game. She's beating him in the metrics that most matter to him. So the question is, or one question is, why do they matter so much? Why does he care? Why does he think that crowd size is a measure of one's worth? Well, it turns out it's because Donald doesn't have any sense of self-worth at all. I've often described him as a black hole of need. You know, he constantly needs to be complimented. He constantly needs to be reassured. And as soon as he gets the compliment, as soon as he gets the reassurance, the light of those compliments and reassurances gets sucked in and disappears because it isn't enough. It has to be a constant flow to keep him propped up. And that's because he can't do it himself. When he was a very young child, his mother, my grandmother, was very ill. So for about a year, starting when Donald was 2.5, he didn't have a primary caregiver. He didn't have somebody there to do the essential pieces of parenting that children at that extremely crucial developmental period need. Toddlers need to be seen. They need to be soothed. They need to be mirrored. And that's when a parent gives back to the child's own emotions, and helps him or her develop an emotional vocabulary. He didn't get any of that. Not only because my grandmother wasn't there for, again, almost a year of his life at probably the most crucial developmental period in his life, or any child's life, but because the person who replaced her, my grandfather, was a straight up textbook sociopath who had absolutely no interest in nurturing children, and he probably wasn't capable of nurturing children. And he only saw any other human being, including his own children, as people who could be of use to him. Those are the circumstances in which Donald grew up, which, as you can imagine, created some serious problems for him. He was never able to construct his own sense of self-worth. And to get through it, he developed these very severe defenses against the world, against his loneliness, against the fact that there was nobody to soothe him. So as time passed, the only way he could get his father's attention was to be sort of hyperbolic about who he was. He's the best, the greatest, the smartest, the most talented.
Nobody builds walls better than me. Nobody in the history of this country has ever known so much about infrastructure as Donald Trump. Nobody knows debt better than me. Nobody even understands it but me. Nobody can do it like me. Which is why I alone can fix it.
On and on and on. And for various much more complicated reasons, which I'll talk about another time, Donald's ability to promote himself, Donald's exaggerated sense of who he was in the world really appealed to my grandfather. The problem for Donald, though, is that on an unconscious level, he knew that none of it was true. He knew that none of what he told people about who he was had any validity whatsoever. So when you see him bragging about his crowd sizes, lying about the polls, undercutting Vice President Harris's numbers, in a tweet, he actually reposted a picture that apparently sought to debunk how large Vice President Harris's crowds were, claiming that it was an AI-generated image, which of course is a lie. So when you see him doing these things, not just when he's denigrating other people, when he's propping himself up and lying through his teeth in order to do it, it's because when he was a very, very, very young child, there was nobody who cared about him to tell him that he was worth anything. And that is a tragedy. You know, we have to have compassion for that child. What we don't have to do is put up with the fact that this man is a monster who means all of us harm. So remember, crowd sizes are completely irrelevant unless you're so desperate to be proven that you mean something that you're willing to lie about them.